guys? Welcome back to the Brainiacs. We're reporting live from the VR on Lawrence campus.
Thank you to Nathan for
thanks,
us
Nathan. Why don't we go all around and introduce ourselves and tell us the amount of times you blacked out?
Are you starting?
Yeah, I'll start. Hi, I'm Jacob Elrod. I've never blacked out.
Hi, I'm Halini. I've blacked out once.
Hi, I'm Ryan Johnson. I've never blacked out.
He's also out of 21.
I don't drink.
Hi, I'm Caroline and I've never blacked out.
Hi, my name is Maria Pimanidu and I've never blacked out.
I'm the only one.
Yeah.
Speaking of alcohol, we're going to talk about this paper where the authors want to explore more about how long-term alcohol exposure can affect impulsivity. They define impulsivity as a construct that
Well, I think it would be helpful to read the first two sentences from the abstract because I think they really capture what the paper is about. So basically, impulsivity is a risk factor for alcoholism, and long-term alcohol exposure may further impair impulse control in a manner that propels problematic alcohol use. So basically, in this study, they're using a model that Ryan will talk more about. It's the five-choice serial reaction time task, and they're measuring behavioral inhibition and attention capacity during the absence of alcohol after repeated periods of time with like a liquid diet. So they want to see how abstinence from alcohol affects impulsivity, and we'll talk about the significance of the study towards the end of like our conversation. But yeah, we can start defining impulsivity.
Yeah, so impulsivity is a construct that basically describes how a subject poorly responds to something, whether that's an automatic response or something that's reward-driven, like the five-choice serial time task.
So basically the five-choice serial reaction time task. It's a operant conditioning paradigm essentially. So there's 6 identical like rat operant chambers. There is 5 holes in these operant chambers, and basically the rats have been trained with a task to poke the holes, and they don't just poke any hole, they only poke a hole that's illuminated with like a light or something. And so there's, for each session of 5CSRTT, there is 100 trials, and for each trial, it's illuminated, like a hole's illuminated. The rat has to poke its nose onto the chamber. And after that, there'd be 2 seconds, which is called like so that's done for 2 seconds. It's called the brief visual stimulus, and then after that, they are given food, like a pellet, as a reward to reinforce the behavior. And after that, there's something called the limited hold, which it lasts for around 2 seconds. And then there's a brief interval waiting period, which is 5 seconds. And then the next session will begin, and that repeats. And basically, if they don't poke their nose in the right chamber, then they are negatively reinforced with like the withdrawal of food pellets. And so basically, give food pellet, reinforce the behavior. Don't give food pellet, then hopefully their behavior changes.
And that's what we learned in class, like operant conditioning.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then is there like a time interval that they?
Yeah, so there's the interval waiting period where that's when the food pellet is initiated, like the reception of food pellet. Also if they like prematurely poke the button or the chamber, that will result in a punishment, which is a timeout, which lasts for 5 seconds, and that's included with a brief period of darkness as well.
So poor inhibition is either doing it too fast or too slow.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Incorrect. Or doing the wrong one.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they kind of tested and used this 5CSRTT test with 2 experiments. Ray, if you want to talk about the first one.
So the first experiment, which wasn't as successful as the second one, was about like repeated cycles of alcohol consumption and withdrawal measures on impulsive action and attention, but it was it was for certain periods of time. So specifically, they first had the training, the one that Ryan just described in the beginning of the experiment, and then they had the liquid diet for 2 groups of rats. So the first group of rats were just on a control diet, so basically no alcohol, and the other group of rats was on an alcohol diet, and that was like the first cycle of them like just being on that diet. And then they would have 9 days of abstinence where they would run all the like attention and impulsive tests and see how the like rats responded. And then they would have a second cycle, so repeated cycles, testing the same thing. Again, 9 days of abstinence, and then again running the same experiments. And then lastly, we had the third cycle, and then at the end they had a longer period of abstinence because they wanted to see like how a longer period of abstinence would affect the experiments that they were running. So they did that for 21 days, and they had short ITI challenges and long ITI challenges. They didn't find any significant results from that. They didn't see if there were any differences in the accuracy or omissions or like times that they did it wrong between the 2 groups, so the alcohol or like the control liquid diet. And they didn't really find any significant results or like between the 2 or any differences between the 2 groups. Even when they were tested on like the longer abstinence period, and I think that's like the time periods and the time intervals was like the main difference from experiment 2. So yeah, you can.
Yeah. So experiment 2 is essentially the same setup. Besides the fact that they do the CSR TT testing in the middle of the experiment rather than at the very beginning, so they go through a few cycles of the wet diet, and then they get to the first abstinence period, and they're trained then to do the time interval test. And the reason for that is because in the first one they were testing sort of a preclinical base, and in this one they wanted to get a real clinical trial. So it just gives more of like a real effect of them not knowing the procedures beforehand and not being attuned to them while they were taking the wet diets, and then during the abstinence periods they would learn, and then they would do them again to get the real test. And
so it's about the training. So it's at the beginning.
And then also the extended abstinence period. So these ones are much longer than in the first test. I think these ones are more like 28 days and 30 days, and then there's a longer one. 34 and 50. So there's longer ones in this, and that was just a test over time. If you have longer periods of abstinence, then does it affect you more than the shorter periods? And so their results at the very beginning were a little varied for both groups, just because when you are teaching them the new test, they all have to like acclimate to it, and they get better and better at the test as it goes along. But then they actually found significant data in the third test, which was I forget which exact abstinence periods they were. I think it was the
34.
34 days. So in that test they found that there was a significant difference between the impulsivity of the rats that were on the diet rather than on the control, which is no alcohol. And that was kind of the most significant finding they had, where they had increased impulsivity, which kind of leads us into our discussion. I don't know, Blaine, if you have any extra points about that you want to talk about that.
Yeah, so when they exposed the rats to alcohol, that improved their inhibition, which is kind of like counterintuitive, but it makes sense because we see like everyday high functional alcoholics. But then after a while, like these inhibitions like re-emerge.
At 34 days.
Yeah, so there's a period of time when you really expose people to or rats to alcohol. It takes a while for them to exhibit these deficits in like behavioral capacity and like behavioral inhibition. So there's a spot.
A longer, so specific days of abstinence and a specific number of abstinence. In this case, 34 days meant that the rats were more impulsive versus like 9 days abstinence or 50 days abstinence.
Yeah, so between the 17 and 34 days, a window where the rats were most likely to show these deficits in inhibition control.
So those rats when they read consumption of the alcohol, and it's like they reset the system in their brain, and after some repeated cycles, the intoxication of alcohol, they will then like increase the impulsivity behavior.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes sense. Like at the big, like for example, you have like if they have only 9 days of abstinence of not having the liquid diet, then they're kind of used to it. Maybe they're expecting it. When it's like 34 days, they become more impulsive. And then maybe at 50 days, they've like broken the habit or like the mentality of them like wanting the alcohol.
Yeah. So like maybe at the beginning, like not to like put human emotion onto it, but like at the beginning, I would imagine that it's a lot easier to like stay off because you want to stay off for the most part. I don't know if that's true in rats, but in humans, like you have like the initial like
drive.
Goal and drive of not wanting to, and then you hit the middle part and it's like I'm kind of tired of doing this. But once you get like far enough, like then you're really like committed to it and you're clean, and maybe that you don't even have like the urges or anything like that. So yeah, it kind of makes sense from a human, like if you translate it to humans, I think it kind of makes sense. We can kind of roll into the results and talk about that.
Yeah, so clearly this study has some interesting implications in like alcohol and inhibition research. Had some very interesting findings, especially with the fact that like with repeated cycles of alcohol intoxication and abstinence, it led to like decreased inhibition or increased impulsive behavior, I should say. Also, like something interesting that I thought that they talked about was that the like dysfunction found with impulse actually was like the dysfunction was decreased after like in further intoxication. So after abstinence, when this impulsivity was increased, the mice were exposed to alcohol again, and then that actually impulsive behavior was actually lowered, which is crazy. Like you wouldn't expect something like that. And also, things like they found that in mice there's like fear conditioning was also changed with alcohol consumption, and negative pattern learning was also changed. So further research into that might figure out like why there maybe impulsivity is controlled through like learning mechanisms within the brain, things like that. As far as like the actual neuroanatomical changes seen with like ETOH exposure, maybe like they found that there's like increased gray matter in the what's it called, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or decreased gray matter in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and which is part of the brain that controls impulsivity. And so it's pretty interesting, like its implications in like the brain and how like the brain influences behavior and stuff like that.
I definitely think that a big like factor to this paper is the finding that they found like the window that they had, so if it's too long, then they're already over it and they won't go back into the impulsive behavior. But if it's too short, they won't do it either. There's like a sweet spot where kind of like you're more prone to go back to what you had before rather than like being abstinent or something like that. So I think that's just interesting that there is a window, and we don't really think about that. Like at the very beginning of someone who's going through AA, like you think that's when you need to give them like the most support, and like maybe if they're taking medication, like that's when you need to be on them about taking it and like making sure that you get through those first like few weeks or whatever. But it turns out that the middle portion of that is when it's the hardest, because you're like, I don't know, like maybe that's when they need to focus more on giving them the help that they need and like increased meetings and stuff like that, because that would just be interesting to see, like even in an observational study, like if you, rather than going to every meeting right at the beginning and then taking your medicine like on the dot right at the beginning, like if you get to the middle portion and they're heavier on you about like being on time, like being like diligent with your medicine rather than earlier or later than that, like maybe that would lead to increased success rates with alcohol and Alcoholics Anonymous.
Which is why this paper is so significant.
It's so contrary to what most people would assume. Like you'd think, behavior and the withdrawal symptoms would, decrease, or the bad behaviors would decrease as your abstinence increases. But you talk about that sweet spot where it's kind of like the bad behaviors, impulsivity, things like that increase at one point, where it's not too bad in the beginning of abstinence, but it gets better later on. So
Yeah, and I think that's definitely like something they could do in the future. Like that's transferable back to the rats. Like you could give them the medicine more so in the middle, or like rather than keep it constant, or like heavier in the beginning and see if that affects anything or something like that. Because I think that's something that you could easily do, just to administer the medicine, and that would give you. I think that's a further experiment they could do that could definitely expand on what they found here, because I think they can kind of scrap experiment 1 given that they didn't find anything, and then go into experiment 2, especially in that period where they found the statistical significance, and really try to like hammer that and see like what tests they can get out of that, because that's clearly the most significant portion of the paper is what they found there. So I think definitely more tests in the future on that specific area would be.
And I think, before, because I know we have some like thoughts on like things that they could improve along with what you just said. I think it's also important to talk about like the reason why like impulsivity or premature responding increases in the and why this is also relative to like previous literature. In the paper it talks about how they found that there was an increase in the glutamate levels during the alcohol absence period, and this contributes to like the increased premature responding, and then the disrupted, what you said, the disrupted cortical GABAergic
the
signaling.
disrupted,
Yeah, so that contributes to like RAS impulsivity and like poor self-control, and not being like as like cognitively flexible. But yeah, I think one of the things that you mentioned for improving is like just narrowing in more experiment 2, and then what else? Does anyone have any suggestions for the?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know how this can be translated from like humans to rats. Like, I don't know if there's what is it called? Face validity. Yeah, I don't know if face validity what I'm gonna say, or because in the paper it said how pre-morbid impulse disorders in humans can like end up making you more probable to like start problematic drinking, and if that somehow can be tested in rats and see if they're more prone to impulse behavior, whether or not they drink, and how much drinking influences that. I think that would be something cool to look at in the future.
I also think it would be nice if they had a greater number of observations, because they only had for each group of rats they only had like 10 or 11 or 12 observations, and then increasing I guess not increasing the time period, because I did find that the sweet spot is around 34, but maybe finding a way to what does that translate into humans, what influences in terms of if someone's a man or a woman, or based on their organism, what affects those days, or is it standard between all?
You can probably also diversify with the impulsivity test, instead of just having one impulsivity test, you can test other parameters. I know in the beginning, in the intro, they have the Barrett impulsivity scale and other kinds of scales, and maybe doing more impulsivity tests will solidify the results, and maybe they can start looking into genes and knocking down genes in rats and see how this would change to actually find the underlying mechanism rather than just strictly behavioral research. I think that would give more hardcore data.
And then you mentioned the time intervals, right?
Yeah. So they have time intervals in the CSRTT survey thing, and basically my issue with that, or what I see might be problematic as far as the results they attain from this, is that when they're measuring impulsivity, they're only doing it on a strict time schedule. So the 2-second brief visual stimulus, the 2-second limited hold period, and then they get the food, then they wait 5 seconds. If they do something wrong, they wait another 5 seconds. So over time, and this is 100 trials per session. So over those 100 trials, they might start to get a feel of okay, I need to do this in order to do this. I think the time should be more randomized and more, fluctuate more, so they can get a more natural reaction. instead of the possibility of these rats learning what to do, and it might skew the results.
So making it as random as possible, like when the time intervals.
I mean, they did say in the paper, like under experiment 2, that it changed these intervals between the trials from like 5 seconds to 6 seconds, or from 7 to like 9. But I don't think that 1 to 2 period, like second increase is enough to say that these rats weren't familiar with the task. I think that familiarity does play a role, especially when you measure like impulsive behavior. And I think they should increase experiment numbers, and like randomize it more to make sure that there's not a link.
I like your idea about also like getting different types of like paradigms, so not just a CS RTT. You get more, you get different tests of impulsivity to like, see if they both display the same kind of results. Yeah, absolutely. Do you guys see anything else wrong with like the study? Any other things that you might find questionable? Maybe not wrong, but just
Limitations.
limitations. Yeah.
I think we pointed out a couple.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing else I would say is in the discussion, they kind of make a broad generalization based on like a very specific case where they find something is statistically significant. I mean, obviously anything statistically significant is important, but at the same time, your whole experiment 1 showed no difference. And you make the generalization essentially that like through your whole test, there was increased impulsivity and stuff like that. So I don't know. I mean, I guess you can say that based on because you did the 2 experiments, because you did find that in one of your experiments, but I think they should kind of disclaimer that with the fact that they only found it in one specific case in one part of the experiment too. So not necessarily like a problem, but just something I think they could retool there, maybe reword to make it more realistic to what they found. Right. And I think definitely it's promising for future research, but I don't know if I would come out and say like that's the case for sure based on my research.
Yeah. But I mean, this study is like, indicating kind of it's really hard to like stop drinking alcohol, I guess, because if you're an alcoholic at least, you talk about if you're trying to abstain from alcohol and you're trying to wean off, going to Alcoholics Anonymous, we see how these, the sweet spot has its effects, and then the cognitive impairments, as it kind of increases at one like certain time, it kind of makes it more difficult for people to just, go on a clear path, straight line to, sobriety. But yeah, it's kind of scary for alcoholics out there.
Don't drink.
Yeah.
Don't black out. Don't be like a lady. Just kidding.
They're all lying about not blacking out. Oh, you're not.
Are we cheering to closing it?
Yeah.
Cheers.
Here's a disclaimer. This is not alcohol. Yeah. Nathan could never.
Shirley Temple.
Sorry.
Okay.
Bye. Thanks for joining.
Do you have any